There's a quiet truth about children who grow up ignored, and it's not a truth that screams. It's the sound of an alarm bell that's had its battery removed. You find yourself succeeding, building a life, maybe even standing on a stage after a professional victory, and yet, you feel nothing. The sensation of emptiness, the emotional numbness, is not a failure of character. It is the deliberate, architectural choice of a mind that learned silence was survival. They often become adults who struggle to believe they deserve attention at all. They walk into a room, a crowded office in Manhattan, a quiet coffee shop in Portland, and the immediate physical urge is to shrink. They enter relationships, and the question is never about whether they are loved, but whether they are too much. They succeed, but instead of allowing the joy to settle, they preemptively wait for it to be overlooked, as if invisibility is their natural, expected state. This is not a lack of talent or worth. It is because the foundation of their sense of self was built in that profound, echoing silence. Psychologists call this an internalized neglect schema, but that clinical term doesn't quite capture the texture of the pain. It means that over time, your brain wired itself to expect neglect. It learned to anticipate dismissal, to assume that your needs, the very essence of what makes you human, were a burden, a heavy coat you must politely leave outside the door. A child who is ignored enough times eventually learns not to ask. They convince themselves that wanting love, affection, or understanding is somehow wrong, that their simple desire for recognition is an imposition on a busy world. Have you ever seen an adult who listens deeply to everyone else's troubles, but when you turn the question back to them, they retreat into a quick, vague dismissal? Oh, me? I'm fine. Don't worry about me. The child who doesn't cry the loudest, who doesn't demand attention, but instead retreats into silence. That child is carrying a weight. On the surface, it might seem like nothing dramatic is happening, but inside that mind, something profound is unfolding, because for a child, being ignored isn't just an inconvenience. It feels like a deep fracture in the very foundation of their existence. And here is the painful truth. Childhood neglect, whether intentional or unintentional, doesn't always look like cruelty. It doesn't always look like explicit abuse. Sometimes it is simply absence. Sometimes it's the unanswered questions, not malicious, just unheard. Sometimes it's the lack of consistent eye contact, the forgotten birthday, or the parent too busy, too tired, too distracted by their own digital life or economic hardship to notice the small bid for connection. This absence creates what we can call the unspoken contract. The child learns that to maintain the fragile peace, they must agree to the following terms. I will not have needs. I will not be loud. I will not inconvenience you with my joy or my pain. But the psychology of the ignored child runs deep. It shapes how they view the world, how they build relationships, and how they define their own worth decades later. We often assume children are resilient, that they bounce back from almost anything. And yes, children do adapt. But adaptation is not the same as healing. When a child learns to live without acknowledgement, they adapt by shrinking themselves, by hiding their needs, by convincing themselves they don't matter as much as others. This adaptation, though it allows them to survive the immediate childhood environment, creates an inner emptiness, a core pain, that quietly follows them into their adult life. A ghost they may not even recognize. In essence, the core pain is the conviction that my existence is conditional, and the condition is silence. To understand the architecture of this silence, we must look for the unmirrored self. Imagine a child, let's call her Maya, in a suburban home outside Chicago. She's 8 years old, runs home from school, clutching a drawing she's genuinely proud of. It's a messy, joyful watercolor of the family dog. She holds it up to show her father, who is physically present but emotionally distant, consumed by the stock market reports flickering on his phone. She tries once, a small, eager tug on his sleeve. He waves her off, his eyes never leaving the screen. Just a second, kid. She tries again, holding the drawing closer, hoping the colors will force his attention. He sighs, irritated by the interruption. I'm working, Maya. Put it on the fridge. She tries a third time at the dinner table, starting a sentence about the art project, but the conversation passes her by. Her mother is tired, recounting her day at the hospital. Eventually, Maya puts the drawing away. Not angrily, not with a dramatic protest, but with a quiet, dull ache. She places it deep inside her backpack, where it won't bother anyone. where the excitement won't be exposed again. And she never mentions it? Now, imagine this happening not once, but dozens, even hundreds of times throughout childhood. What did Maya learn in those small, silent moments? She learned that excitement, pride, even simple joy, are things best kept to herself. She learned that the emotion itself, the simple act of wanting to share, of needing validation, is not just ignored, but actively disruptive to the world she depends on. She learned to live in a room without mirrors. When a child's emotions, thoughts, and triumphs are consistently met with silence or distraction, they are not being reflected back. That reflection is vital. It is how the child confirms the reality of their own inner life. It's how they answer the question, am I real? Do my feelings have weight in this world? Without that reflection, the self remains unmirrored. The identity becomes fragile, perpetually seeking validation, not because the person is shallow, but because they were never given the chance to fully see themselves confirmed in the safe love of another. This creates the glass house effect in adulthood. You become hyper-vigilant, living in a house built of transparent walls. You can look out and see every subtle shift in mood, every need, every impending storm in the lives of the people around you. Your survival depended on reading others, on knowing when it was safe to speak, or when silence was the only viable option. You become the best listener, the most empathetic friend, the quiet observer who knows exactly what others require, but no one can truly see into the house. And the emotional cost is immense. You become fluent in everyone else's language of need, but effectively mute in your own. You tune into the whole world, while gradually tuning yourself out. This is the quiet tragedy of the ignored child. They develop the ability to see others with profound clarity, while simultaneously losing the ability to see the inherent worth of their own light. The emotional wounds of neglect are subtle, but the biological mechanism is anything but. The silent contract we established, I will not have needs, is enforced by the body itself, specifically through a phenomenon we can call the interrupted circuit. When a child reaches out for connection, a giggle, a cry, a question, a plea for help, and that bid is ignored, the brain registers it as a fundamental threat. Not just social disappointment, but a threat to survival. This isn't a psychological theory. This is the observable activation of the stress response system. The body floods with cortisol. The heart rate increases. The nervous system shifts into a state of high alert, interpreting the silence not as benign absence, but as active rejection. Over time, when this pattern is repeated, when the child's attempts at intimacy are consistently met with the cold, damp response of silence or distraction, the brain begins to adapt to the threat. Adaptation, in this context, is the problem. The brain is efficient. It seeks to minimize the energy expenditure of constant stress. If every attempt at connection results in a cortisol spike, the brain learns a powerful lesson. Stop trying. The system is rewired to expect and anticipate rejection. Their emotional baseline becomes one of anxiety, and their emotional regulation becomes fragile. But the most profound adaptation occurs in the brain's reward centers. Think of the dopamine circuit. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter responsible for anticipation, motivation, and registering pleasure or reward. When a child shares their joy, like Maya with her painting, and receives acknowledgement, a smile, a hug, that's wonderful, that circuit is reinforced. The brain learns. This feeling is good. Connection is a reward. But for the ignored child, the opposite happens. The effort to seek connection is met with an emotional void. The brain registers the cost, the stress, the disappointment, without the reward. To protect itself from this repeated cost, the brain learns a crucial, self-sabotaging lesson. It learns to turn the volume to zero on its own emotional signal. This isn't just psychological withdrawal, it's a deliberate dampening of the reward system. The brain effectively pulls the circuit on the expectation of pleasure derived from recognition. The goal is to minimize the pain of disappointment, but the neurological collateral damage is immense. By dampening the circuit on anticipation and reward, the ignored child is neurologically predisposed to emotional blunting, and, eventually, Anhedonia. The individual becomes an adult who is physically incapable of fully experiencing the emotional warmth of their own successes or connections. The system has learned that the safest way to exist is to feel less. It's not a moral failure or a lack of personal willpower. It is a meticulously crafted, self-defensive neurological architecture built entirely out of prolonged silence. The harm in being ignored is that the damage is so subtle, so invisible. A child who is outright mistreated bears visible scars. But when a child is ignored, the damage is woven into the very wiring of their nervous system, dictating their anxiety levels and their capacity for joy decades later. Their baseline is set to a quiet, anxious hum, and the cost of trying to feel again always seems too high. The damage caused by emotional neglect is often called emotional neglect. Unlike physical neglect, which leaves scars you can see, the visible marks of physical deprivation, emotional neglect leaves hidden scars beneath the surface. These scars often don't fully appear until adulthood, when the ignored child tries to build intimacy, chase a career dream, or simply find meaning and run straight into the quiet, unhealed wounds of their past. These scars manifest in two primary paradoxical ways, both rooted in the expectation of dismissal. First, there is the struggle with low self-esteem and deep hesitation. These adults hesitate to share their thoughts, believing nobody truly cares, or that their thoughts lack the weight and gravity of others' opinions. They may fear rejection so deeply that they subtly avoid relationships altogether, choosing the controllable pain of isolation over the unpredictable terror of being truly seen and then discarded. Second, there is the reaction of desperate chasing and performance. Conversely, many adults who grew up feeling unseen desperately chase approval, bending over backwards to keep others happy. They become the classic people pleaser, the one who cannot say no, who takes on burdens that are not theirs. Deep down, they are still running the same psychological program from childhood, trying to earn the acknowledgement and validation they missed years ago. Their identity is outsourced. Their worth is tied directly to their utility to others. Let's look closer at the inner dynamic of the ignored child. When a child is outright mistreated, the external harm is obvious, and the self knows who the aggressor is. But when a child is simply ignored, the damage is more subtle. The self internalizes the fault. If they aren't seeing me, I must not be worthy of being seen. The environment becomes a mirror that reflects nothing, and the child's identity is constructed around a void. This leads to a profound sense of ambiguous loss. There is no dramatic story to tell, no event to point to, no scars to show, just the memory of countless small moments that should have mattered but didn't. How do you explain to a therapist, or even to a friend, what it feels like to be invisible? The absence of something essential is, in itself, a form of trauma. It's like growing up in a house without proper air circulation. Just because you survived doesn't mean you were breathing freely. This silence itself becomes a barrier. Adults who grew up ignored often hesitate to seek help, fearing that they will be dismissed again, a repetition compulsion. They might minimize their experiences in therapy, saying, "Nothing really bad happened to me," because they were taught that their own subjective distress was not valid or important enough to mention. The psychology of the ignored child creates a profound emotional split. They learn to separate the performing, adaptive self, the one who earns A's, the one who is helpful, from the needy, vulnerable self, the one who aches, who requires comfort. The needy self is locked away, deemed too dangerous and burdensome to ever be revealed. The adult life then becomes the exhausting, relentless task of maintaining the adaptive mask while ensuring the vulnerable child inside remains locked in the silent room. This is the heavy lifting of the ignored adult, a silent, energy-draining form of emotional labor they perform every single day. This constant maintenance of the adaptive mask brings us to the core, MindRabbit insight. Anhedonia is the echo of unheard joy. It is easy to categorize the ignored adult as suffering from low confidence, but the psychological mechanism goes deeper than self-esteem. It is rooted in the failure of the brain's reward system to recognize its own achievements. Recall Maya with her drawing. When her moment of pride and excitement was consistently met with absence, the brain learned, this feeling is costly and yields no external reward. Over time, the neurological connections that link a personal triumph, the completion of a long project, the establishment of a deep friendship, to the internal sensation of joy begin to atrophy. They thin out. The result is anhedonia, Anhedonia, often misunderstood as mere sadness, is the profound, quiet inability to experience pleasure, satisfaction, or reward. The ignored child who becomes an adult often finds that they can logically recognize their success. They see the raise, the diploma, the happy partner, but they cannot feel it. The emotional volume is turned down to zero. Success is a meal you cooked but cannot taste. You have the achievement, the structure, the external validation, but the internal reward mechanism has been hijacked by the protective architecture of silence. The child learned that excitement was best kept to themselves. The adult now finds that even when they try to release that excitement, the mechanism simply won't engage. It's an interrupted circuit, a neurological choice to prioritize safety, not feeling disappointed, over the vulnerability of joy, feeling satisfied. This quiet, chronic emptiness is the signature wound of the ignored adult. They are often high-functioning, driven, and outwardly successful because their childhood coping mechanism taught them to earn attention through performance. They are often praised as so motivated or so independent, but beneath that drive is exhaustion. The exhaustion of constantly performing to fill a void that performance was never meant to fill. For this adult, the most terrifying thing is not failure, but stasis. If they stop moving, if they stop achieving, the silence rushes back in, bringing with it the core conviction that they are fundamentally unworthy of being seen. The continuous motion, the burnout, the inability to truly rest is simply the adult continuation of the child's desperate attempt to finally earn the acknowledgement that was missed. They are perpetually running an emotional account that they can never balance. Every achievement is immediately spent on proving their worth, leaving no psychological surplus for rest or genuine, unadulterated pleasure. This constant emotional deficit is the fuel for the modern epidemic of high-functioning burnout, where the life looks polished on the outside but feels like an empty shell on the inside. This is why traditional motivational advice fails them. You cannot fake it till you make it when the core neurological mechanism for making it is offline. You need to understand the silence first. The tragedy deepens when we examine the paradox of the ignored adult. They often become one of the most empathetic people you will ever meet. This isn't simply a nice personality trait. It's an advanced, highly specialized survival skill. The ignored child had to develop strong observational skills. They learned to read faces, tones of voice, minute shifts in posture, and small fluctuations in mood because their psychological safety depended on it. They had to sense when it was safe to speak, when the parent was available, or when silence was the only option. Their hyper-awareness was a radar system, constantly scanning for the emotional state of the caregiver. This radar system becomes a powerful force in adulthood, leading to the hidden tax of hyper-empathy. You see a colleague's stress before they mention it. You intuit a friend's hidden sorrow before they cry. You are the rock, the confidant, the person who always knows what to say. You are fluent in everyone else's language of need, but as we discussed, you remain mute in your own. The tax is the inner depletion. You are constantly pouring energy into understanding and regulating the emotional lives of others, but there is no reciprocal flow. The ignored self, the vulnerable child locked inside, is never addressed. You are tuning the whole world while consistently tuning yourself out. This is the source of the profound fatigue that often accompanies the high-functioning ignored adult. Furthermore, this hyper-empathy fuels the external identity search. Because the ignored child was never properly mirrored back by the caregiver, their core sense of identity remains blurry, undefined. They grew up without a clear reflection of their own emotions and thoughts validated by another's love. As adults, they may constantly seek validation from external sources, a relationship, a job title, a social cause, not because they are vain, but because they are still trying to piece together the fragmented identity that was never fully confirmed in childhood. Identity grows in connection. Without that consistent, secure reflection, selfhood remains fragile, forever dependent on the external environment to confirm its reality. This can result in the feeling of ambiguous selfhood. You know who you should be and who you are for others, but when you are alone in your own apartment in the quiet hours after midnight, the question remains, who am I when no one is looking? The silence of those hours is not peaceful. It is often the quiet rush of the void, the cold air of the internal draft that blows through the chambers of the heart, reminding you that a deep, chronic loneliness persists, regardless of your social circle. It is a loneliness rooted in the profound separation from the self, rather than separation from others. The greatest emotional distance you face is the one between the performing self and the essential, aching self you locked away years ago. You are lonely because the person you need to see you most, you, is the one you are professionally ignoring. So, where does the slow, careful process of healing begin? Not with a rush of motivation, and certainly not with the pursuit of perfection. It begins with recognition. For the ignored child who grew into an adult, the first step is often giving yourself the acknowledgement you didn't receive. This is not self-help cliché. It is a foundational psychological necessity. It is the simple, powerful act of saying to yourself, in the quietest part of your mind, "What happened to me mattered. My needs were real. My pain is valid." This act of recognition is a neurological revolution. It sends a signal of safety to the limbic system, the very part of the brain that was wired to expect threat and dismissal. It tells the nervous system, the constant state of vigilance is no longer required. You are establishing a secure internal attachment, a relationship of consistent acknowledgement with yourself. This requires moving from the adaptive mask to self-witnessing. You've spent decades observing and validating the emotional lives of others. Now, you must become the most reliable witness to your own story. Healing is not about erasing the past. It's about learning to hold the memory of the silence without letting it dictate your present volume. How does self-witnessing translate into practice? It can be as small as pausing to celebrate your own wins, regardless of how small they appear to the external world. If you manage to set a boundary, stop and allow yourself the feeling of pride. If you finished a task, allow the satisfaction to register. This is the gentle work of rerouting the interrupted dopamine circuit. You are teaching your brain, moment by moment, that internal achievement is worthy of an internal reward, independent of external validation. It can be as profound as naming your feelings out loud, even if only to yourself. When you feel that familiar ache of loneliness, dare to whisper it, "I feel lonely right now." When you feel hurt, dare to say, "My feelings are hurt." You are validating the inner child who was taught that their feelings were too heavy, too burdensome, to be carried. You are giving that suppressed vulnerability a voice. This process will feel terrifying. The ignored adult often fears rejection more than anything, so speaking up can feel like risking annihilation. Setting a boundary can feel like a profound betrayal of the unspoken contract. Asking for help can feel like weakness, but the courage to do those things despite the fear is what slowly repairs the self. It is important to acknowledge the complexity of the cycle. Most parents who ignore their children don't do so out of cruelty. Often they themselves were ignored, overwhelmed by stress, or lost in their own struggles. This context does not excuse the wound, but it reminds us that cycles of neglect often stretch back through generations. When an adult begins to heal from being ignored, they are not only healing themselves, they are breaking a chain that may have lasted decades. Every ignored child who learns to listen to themselves becomes a parent, a friend, or a partner who listens better. Every person who learns to value their needs becomes someone who teaches others that their needs matter, too. Healing, in its quietest form, ripples outward. The psychology of the ignored child is a story of pain, yes, but also of extraordinary quiet resilience. It is the story of how silence can create wounds, but also how breaking that silence, even just internally, can create profound wisdom. You were never truly invisible. You were simply waiting for the world, or, more accurately, waiting for yourself to be ready to see. The journey of healing is about realizing that being ignored shaped you, but it does not define you. It has given you a unique form of strength. The ignored child often develops a deeper, more profound empathy, precisely because they know the sting of being unseen. They know how to hold space for others, because no one held that space for them. This heightened sensitivity, this hyper-awareness that was once a survival burden, can be slowly, deliberately turned into a gift of presence. You can learn to apply that profound observational skill not just to the pain of others, but to the subtle, vital needs of your own inner landscape. The deepest work in this final phase is the act of rehumanizing the needy, vulnerable self that was locked away. When you look back, you realize the greatest injustice was not that the world ignored you, but that you were trained to internalize that neglect and ignore yourself, your needs, your joy, your exhaustion, your boundaries. The truth is, acknowledgement isn't something you outgrow. The human need to be seen doesn't vanish with age. It just goes underground, where it fuels anxiety, anhedonia, and chronic loneliness. The journey of healing is about bringing that fundamental need back into the light. It's about recognizing that you do not need permission to be tired, permission to be proud, or permission to need comfort. You are already authorized. Think of it this way. You have been living your adult life operating on a high-cost emotional energy system. Every time you achieve something, you spend the entire reward proving your worth. Healing is about installing a sustainable, internal energy source. It is about learning to create your own light, your own reflection, without requiring the external validation that proved so unreliable in the past. It is about realizing that the sense of worth you were desperately trying to earn has been there all along, woven into the simple fact of your existence. This final act of self-acceptance, the courage to stop performing and simply be, is what slowly dismantles the architecture of silence. Every moment you choose to listen to yourself, every boundary you set, every instance you dare to say, "I feel hurt," instead of swallowing the pain, becomes like a drop of water wearing away the stone of old wounds. You are rewriting the unspoken contract. The new contract states simply, your presence is not an imposition. Your needs are not a burden. You are allowed to take up space. In the end, the child who was ignored often becomes the adult who refuses to ignore others, and critically, refuses to ignore themselves. And in that conscious, messy, brave choice, they discover the truth that they were never defined by the silence of the past, but by the quiet, resilient strength it took to survive, and finally, to speak. The work is internal, quiet, and necessary, and it begins now.